Hey folks, Matt from artoftheimage.com. Just did a recent video answering a viewer question about why anyone would still choose a Canon DSLR when Nikon dominates the top 10 as far as the performance of the cameras. We had a look at that, and it's true on DxO Mark. The ones that was a few days ago we did that, but the 6 out of 10, the top 10, 6 of them were Nikons. We had 3 Sonys in there and 1 Pentax. No Canons in the top 10. So you can see where he's getting where the question is coming from, where he's getting the question. Why would you buy a Canon camera, a Canon DSLR, when their performance is so lackluster? But we've got some good counterpoints, some good feedback from you guys on that video that I wanted to share. Some really good points here. First, Chris Barr writes in, this isn't really a counterpoint, but he's kind of giving an explanation. He says, that's because Nikon got those Sony sensors, LOL. Which is true. They're using a lot of Sony sensors. However, the interesting thing here is you do need to give kudos to Nikon still, because Nikon is usually able to get better performance out of a Sony sensor than Sony is. If you look at the 24 megapixel APS-C bodies, the Nikons do better than the Sonys do with Sony's own sensor, which is kind of interesting. You have to give them credit for that. And then Good Free Photos says because people are stuck on Canon glass. That's the real reason. And that's an interesting point. And one we could flesh out a little here, because if you're already heavily into a system, it is expensive to switch. And while we're talking about what cameras are the best performing, that's by no means saying that if you had an 80D or a 7D Mark II or a 5D Mark III or Mark IV or a 1DX Mark II, that those are bad performing cameras, because they're not. In the end, in real world shooting situations, a good photographer is going to be able to, it's going to come down to the photographer, not the gear, if you're using one of those against an equivalent Nikon or an equivalent Sony. They're still very good. They're just not as good as the Nikons. Still very good performing cameras, and for some things like ergonomics and other things besides pure specs on the actual performance of the sensor, some people like other things about the cameras better. There was a comment made here, Untouchable 360X. I remember this comment jumped into my mind in relation to what I just said there. Why buy a Ferrari when it's not in the top 10 car list? So just because something isn't in the top 10 of performance, there's still other reasons to buy something. And it may come down to, as I said, ergonomics. It may come down to value for the money. It may come down to you prefer the lens system. So you're buying a camera that you quite like, and you like the lens system better, and you're already perhaps heavily invested in it. So that's a good point too. Dunny Monster says, and this is an interesting comment, because a lot of people I think would agree with Dunny here, I hold very little credibility in DxO scores. Irrespective of their tests, the reality is Canon is still head and shoulders above everybody, Nikon included, in terms of sales. Now, how much longer that continues is another thing. Camera sales are in decline, and the likes of Sony and Fuji are slowly eating away at the established Nikon-Canon duo. I've no doubt that Canon's lack of features and apparent innovation will see their top spot in sales decline soon. So, and then Mark Marion commented to that comment, their sales are based on name and history, which I think is largely true. So that's a good point that he's making here. How much weight or credibility do you actually put into the DxO scores? As I said in that video when we were discussing it, like anything else, it's one of a number of tools or one of a number of pieces of information that you have available to you when you're trying to evaluate what to buy as far as a camera. Do you make that the be-all and the end-all? I don't think you should, but it's something that you can factor in. And then it just becomes how much weight you put on that is up to you. So good point from Dunny there. Michael Simmons says, I guess I just love Panasonic. Get the GH5 or its little brother, the G85. So interesting comment there. I mean, I really like the Panasonic cameras. I'm shooting with, as he said, the little brother, the G85 right now. Great video camera. And for bang for your buck, pretty hard to beat. Very good photography camera too. Does it rank in the top 10 of sensor performance? No. If we were looking at the best cameras to shoot video with, and I was making a top 10, it would certainly be in there, because there's a lot of other factors that come into play. But as far as just pure sensor performance, it's very good, but it's not in the top 10. But is it something that I then wouldn't recommend? No, absolutely. I would totally recommend it for a variety of other reasons. So, interesting point there. And let's see, what else do we have here? Canon 5D Mark III influence is still on Earth, which moved most of photographers to buy Canon. That's from Sing H. And that's a good point. The Canon 5D Mark III in its day was a very, very good camera, very strong performer. I don't know. I don't know if we could even go back to look at that. I'd have to go and dig up each one of the cameras that was around the 5D Mark III and see how it compared to competing cameras. But that was a very strong seller. It was a very good hybrid video camera, and a lot of people went to Canon for that camera. So again, other reasons why you might buy a camera, why you might buy into a system, other than just the pure performance of the individual camera. And we've got Gregor Mima saying, it's old news, Canon's sensors suck. That said, camera is not just a sensor. Reason why Nikon failed in the 90s, because Canon's service was superior compared to crap Nikon. And don't forget, in today's cams, you have Canon and Sony sensors. Just the body comes from Nikon, Fuji, Pentax, Sony, Canon. Oh, and DSLR video is dead. So that's interesting. It's a good point. I wouldn't say they suck, but they certainly have fallen behind where Canon used to lead the pack, and then they used to rely on that. And I think they've had a hard time switching their head around or getting their head around the new reality that their sensors are not the best. Ever since the Nikon D3, D700, and D300, that whole situation flipped around. And whereas Canon were leading Nikon, Nikon has now been leading Canon as far as the performance of the cameras for quite some time. I'd actually love to see Canon come back around and actually leapfrog Nikon again. I think it's good. It's good for competition. It's good to have. It's not good. It's not good to have one company dominating for so long, because it might make them rest on their laurels, as Canon has been doing, and it doesn't give the customer lots of options. And especially for those of us that are heavily into the Canon glass, you want to have better options. So yeah, that's an interesting point. And then Von Felix says, but Canon, because it just feels so good and works so well. DxO marks are all negligible in the real world. If you're a vlogger who wants 4K, then that might be a reason. So good point there. Canon's really weak right now in 4K, although I think that's going to change in 2018. But back to what I was saying earlier, he says Canon because it just feels so good and works so well. So ergonomics and just how you like the camera and how it fits in your hands and how you like shooting with it in real world terms is probably a better reason to choose it than whether or not it's in the top 10, and whether or not, a competing system, maybe you don't like the ergonomics or the layout or the menus or whatnot as much, or even the glass. I wouldn't buy it then, because, as I said, all these cameras are capable. They're close enough that they're all capable of top performance in a good photographer's hands. So some great feedback here. I really like a lot of what you guys had to say here, and I just wanted to discuss some of that and throw that in. So thanks for your feedback. Again, feel free to leave if you have other comments on that. Let us know in the comments below. We can flesh it out some more. But you guys always have some great stuff to say, some great feedbacks. Oftentimes feedback that makes me think or brings up another question, which is fantastic. Thanks to you guys. Stay tuned. We'll be back soon here on artoftheimage.com.